With the release of GenerateBlocks 2.0, I've been doing a lot more videos trying to push the boundaries of what we're able to do inside the editor. This has included all kinds of different animations and advanced selectors, but really what I'm seeing people talk about inside the GenerateBlocks Facebook group or inside of their support forum is really figuring out how to do all the basic things now that the UI and the process for doing all these things has changed. So I thought in today's video we'd take a step back and take a look at a section that's a little bit more typical of something you'd probably build inside a client project, and I'm going to walk you through my process of how I'd go about building this out. This is going to include setting up CSS Grid and Flexbox, giving everything classes, and really going in there and dialing in the responsiveness, including creating some custom breakpoints. If that sounds interesting to you, then stick around and let's get started. So starting off with a blank page here inside the editor, I'm just going to make sure I'm on this page tab, and I'm going to scroll down here to the disable elements. That's a feature inside GeneratePress Premium. I'm just going to go ahead and disable all the elements on here. I just want a blank screen so we can only focus on this section that we're creating. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in here and add a container to our page. And then while I have it selected, I'm going to go ahead and click this button here to give us an inner container, which will just constrain everything to our website's content width. Now this section itself definitely needs some padding, and as I've gone over in other videos, I do have some default classes I've set up here for section padding, so I'll go ahead and click on this section D, which is just my default padding. If you want to understand a little bit more about how these work, I have created a video on how I use Clamp to do all this section padding, and I'll make sure to put that link down in the description. We'll go ahead and pop open our list view here so we can see everything and kind of name things as we go. We'll just call this our section. Inside of it, we'll call this our wrapper, and we'll make sure that on our section here, we go to our settings cog and we change this tag name from a div to a section. Let me go ahead and bring our design back up here so we can kind of plan out what we're going to need to do. Inside of our wrapper, we're going to need some kind of card here that gives us this background and border, and then we're going to need two columns inside of it. The left column will have all of our text content, and the right column will have our image here. Now inside of this text column, we're going to need some kind of box to contain these two things to keep them together, and then some kind of grid layout here for these four items that are underneath it. So let's go ahead and get that basic architecture set up. Inside of our wrapper here, I'm going to go ahead and add another container, and we'll just go ahead and call this service-card since this is our service card. We'll go ahead and start with the blank style. And I think just to get started, I'm going to go ahead and get some of the basic structure inside of here. So we know inside of that, we're going to have two columns. So I'll go ahead and add two containers. Went ahead and added one, and then I'll duplicate it just to have a second. We'll go ahead and rename this just to keep things clear. We'll call that our card. And here we'll call this left column. And next to it, we'll call this one right column. Now that we got those in there, let's go back to our card, make sure we're on our service card class, and we can do a little bit of styling here. We know that we're going to want a side-by-side layout. For me, the easiest option for this is CSS Grid. So we can go ahead and change the display to grid. And if we go into grid layout here, we can click on the preset button and choose the two-column layout. That will go ahead and put the left column on the left and the right column on the right, which is exactly what we want. Back here on our card and making sure we're on that card class, let's go ahead and give it some of our styles. So we know as far as backgrounds, we need a slightly darker background than our background color, which I have one here called sand. We also have a border radius on this. I'm going to go ahead and give it 16 pixels of border radius. And we also have a slight border, so I'm going to give it a 1 pixel border, and we're going to go with our darker sand color here, so it's just slightly darker than the background. Now we'll probably have to come back to this later to make some additional tweaks, but I think this is a good starting place for us. The column on the right is going to be a little bit easier, so let's go ahead and start there. We'll just go ahead and insert an image block in here. We'll go to our media library, and then we'll just select the image we're going to be using for this project, which is just a mock-up of Figma. For reasons I don't fully understand and haven't bothered to investigate, anytime we add an image like this, there's a margin at the bottom, but I can't seem to get rid of that with any kind of spacing or sizing in here. Even if I go in and add a bottom margin of 0, it doesn't seem to clean that up. However, if we go back to our column, which is our right column here, if we change this to Flexbox, it will get rid of that space. So I'm just going to go ahead and give this a class before we add any styles to it. I want to try to give classes to everything because it's great insurance to have in case we ever need to reuse this and want to make changes globally. I really refrain from putting things on the default class that GenerateBlocks gives us unless I know I'm never going to need to use that again. So if we remember, this was called our service card. So I'm going to go ahead and type in service card, and then I'm going to use 2 underscores here because I'm loosely following BIM naming convention, although I am not a BIM expert, so you'll probably see me make mistakes on that. But this is our service card image hyphen wrapper. So we'll go ahead and hit create, and we can start with a blank style. And all I'm going to do here is change this display from default to flex. And when I do that, you can see that little bottom gap we had there goes away. Now, referencing our design again, you can see we have a nice gap between the top of this image and the top of our card. I'm going to go ahead and do that by adding some padding to this image wrapper. So we'll go back in here, make sure we're still on our service card image wrapper, and we'll go in here into the spacing, and I'm going to start with maybe 60 pixels of top padding. Now, one thing I'm noticing right away is the bottom corner of our image is peeking out of the side of our card. Right now we have that card set to have a border radius on it, but the image is going on top of that and going outside of that border radius. A quick way to fix that is by using overflow. So I'm going to go back into our card here, back into our service card class. And if we go down here to the position tab, we can go into our overflow X and set it to hidden, as well as our overflow Y, set that to hidden. And now you'll see it's going ahead and clipping off that image because anything that overflows this container is going to get hidden. I think for now, that's a good starting point with our image. So let's turn our attention to this left column, which is our content wrapper. We'll go ahead and give this class as well. I will call it service card double underscore content hyphen wrapper. We'll go ahead and create that class, and we'll start editing. Now, right now, there's no gap in between our 2 columns, and I think that's actually going to work okay in this instance. What I want to do to create the space in between our 2 columns is have an even amount of padding around all of this content here. So to do that, I'm just going to go into our spacing inside of our padding. I'll lock all those values together, and I'll match that 60 pixels we did at the top over here. That's just going to make sure that this column has 60 pixels of padding all the way around it. If we reference our drawing again, we'll see we kind of have this content separated in 2 parts. First, there's the header of this card, which has the headline and subheadline, and then there's another little section underneath that has the grid here with the icon and subheadlines. So to do that, I'm going to start by just adding 2 containers in here. This first one will be for our header. I'll go ahead and use my keyboard by pressing Shift-Command-D to duplicate that and create a second one, and this is going to be the one for our grid. Now, inside of this first container, we're going to go ahead and add a headline block here. We'll imagine that we're building this as a part of a bigger page and it has an H1 on it. I think an H2 is probably going to be more common in this scenario, but you'll have to follow whatever the hierarchy is of your page. Now, this headline just says Figma to WordPress, but I can see that the text in here is a little bit too big. The H2 title just doesn't fit great inside of this contained layout. Now, thanks to my typography calculator, which again, I have a video on, so I'll make sure to link that in the description. I have some utility classes that I can change the size of this headline to still fit within my typography scale. To do that, I'm just going to go back here to our settings wheel. We'll go into our advanced, and here under additional classes, I'm going to type in FS for font size and then type in H3, which will make this headline the same size as my H3 headings on the website. Now, this is all done because I've already added that CSS to this website, but it's a really handy set of utility classes because this way we can make sure instead of willy-nilly picking different font sizes, we're picking something from our specific type scale. Underneath that, we have a sub headline here, so I'm going to go ahead and paste in that text. When I paste in text here, it's going to come in as a default paragraph block, but I want to change that to a GenerateBlocks text block just to make sure I have all the styling controls I need. Here I can see there's a little bit too much gap in between the headline and subheadline here. That gap is actually coming from bottom margin that's applied to our H2 headings by default. I definitely want to tighten this up in this circumstance, so I'm going to call this service card double underscore title. We'll go ahead and create that class. We'll start blank and we'll go here under our spacing, and in the margin, even though we don't see something here, there is default margin coming in. I'm going to change this to something maybe like 6 pixels just to tighten up that space there, and I think that looks pretty good. Back to our drawing, we can see this second section of content down here is a grid. It has 2 columns and 2 rows. Anytime I see something like this, I know CSS Grid is going to make this really easy. So we'll go back in here into the editor and I'll make sure I select this container. Now, we're definitely going to want to give this a class, so I'm going to call this service-card double underscore features-wrapper. We'll go ahead and hit create, and we can start with a blank class. And we'll go in here to our layout. We'll change this to display grid. And here on the grid template columns, we'll go ahead and select 2 columns. Now this preset here is going to work perfect for us, and it's going to have implicit rows. So if we add more than 2 pieces of content in here, it's going to put those on additional rows, which is perfect. That just means we don't have to mess with the grid template rows here. It's pretty rare you're setting grid template rows explicitly unless you're doing some kind of bento grid layout, or if you want to make sure that rows are a different size than one another. But in this case, I think this is going to work just fine. Now we're going to want to encapsulate the icon, heading, and text all in a little group together. So I want to make sure to wrap that inside of a container here. Now we'll go ahead and just set up one of these, and then we can duplicate it. So the first thing we're going to need in here is a shape block. So I'll go ahead and add the shape block for our icon. I'll press enter here and we'll add a headline block. Since this is an H2 here, I think these can safely be an H3. They might work as a paragraph as well, or we could even set this up as a list, but I think for now, H3 works fine. Our first text in here is performance focused. Obviously, this H3 headline is the same size as this headline up here, which is our H2. That's because we resized this H2 headline to match the size of our H3. So we're definitely going to need this headline to be smaller. I'm going to use that same trick I did before here inside of our settings tab under advanced. I'm going to type in FS-H6 because I actually want this to be a pretty small headline. I'm going to make it the same size as our H6 headlines. We'll go ahead and press enter again. I'm going to go ahead and add a text block here, and then I'll just paste in the text that goes along with this heading. Now again, we have some spacing issues here. I don't mind the amount of space that we have in between our icon and headline right now, but there's definitely too much default bottom margin with this heading in between the text. It looks like these things are separated. So we'll go back here to our performance focused H3 headline, and we'll give this a class. We'll call this service-card _feature-title. We'll go ahead and hit create. We'll start with a blank style. And underneath this, we're going to change this to something maybe like 4 pixels just to really tighten those up. Let's go ahead and rename some of these items in our list view. I'll rename this to features wrapper just so we can keep track of everything. And we'll call this feature item. Go ahead and save that just so we can keep track here. And I'm going to use my keyboard again, the Shift Command D this time to duplicate this so we have 4 copies of it here. Now, obviously we have a bit of a problem with these all bunching up next to each other. We definitely need to add some gap in between our grid here. So we'll go back to our features wrapper and we'll make sure we're selecting that class. And here under the display settings for our grid layout, I'll go ahead and add maybe 24 pixels of row and column gap, which will just space these things out nicely. Now, because of the UI here in GenerateBlocks, it's really kind of squishing down this column. But if we go ahead and get rid of the list view here and get rid of that sidebar, we can see everything's fitting quite a bit nicer here. I think I'll go ahead and swap out this copy here so we have all of our final copy in here. I'll pause the video and pick back up after I've done that so you don't have to watch me copy and paste content. All right, so I've got all that content switched out now so we have all of our new copy as well as the icons. Now I will show you here when you add an icon block or a shape block here. Over here under the settings tab, we have the shape here. I just went into our custom SVG and pasted in the SVG I'm using. I typically pull all my SVGs from this icons website. So if I went in here and search for clock, we can find our clock icon here. We can copy on this SVG snippet, and then we can paste it directly in here, which will give us that clock icon. Now, obviously we don't need a clock for that one, so I'm gonna undo those changes, but that icons website is a great way to easily be able to bring in icons here inside of GenerateBlocks. Now, one thing I didn't do was give these icons a class, so if we decided we wanted to change the color or the size of them, we'd have to do them one by one. Now, in this case, I don't really need to change the size or the color of them, but I want to future-proof this site and make sure that if I do ever want to make those changes, I can do it to all 4 of them at once and not have to do them one by one. So let's go ahead and add that class now. We'll call this service card _feature icon. We'll go ahead and hit create. Now this time the block did have some styles on it. By default, when you add this shape block, it puts a size and color on it. I want to make sure to move all of those local styles over to the class. So we're going to move the local block styles and hit start editing. Now I want to go ahead and add this class to each one of these. So I'm going to find that service card features icon, and we'll go ahead and add this to each one of these. We do need to make sure we get rid of those block styles on all of these as well. So I'll go back through and make sure we erase our block styles. And now if we wanted to make changes to these icons, for example, if we wanted to change the color, we could go into that class, and here under the More dropdown, we can select the SVG. And under typography, we could pick whatever color we want for these icons, and it's going to automatically update all 4 of them. So it's a good thing that we have all of these on a class. Now for this particular layout, we don't need to make those changes. So I'm just going to go ahead and exit out of this selector since we don't need to make any more changes to it. Back to our original design again, we can see we're getting a whole lot closer, but we need to add a gap in between this header column here and this grid of items below it. So let's go back to the editor. I'm going to pop open our list view again, even though that kind of squishes things. And we're going to make sure we have this left column selected and make sure we're on that service card content wrapper. Now to get that gap in between these, what I think I'm going to do is change this to a display of flex. That's going to screw up everything here temporarily, but if we go into our flex layout and change this back to column, everything's going to go back to the way it was before. However, I want to change the alignment on this. Right now, by default, it's just aligning things to the align start and then justifying the content to the flex start, which is the top left corner essentially with those 2 things. But what I want to do is put space between on this justify content. What that's going to do is make sure that this top container is pushed all the way to the top and the bottom container is pushed all the way to the bottom. Now, the confusing part about this is the UI gets in the way a bit. We have this add block icon here, which is actually being affected by these settings. So right now you're not seeing that push down, but you'll see it once I click off of that, this grid here where our features are is going to be pushed to the bottom of this container. So if we click off of that and then get rid of our list view over here, we can see we have a bigger gap now in between this container and this container here. It's going ahead and maintaining our 60 pixels of padding all the way around it, but it's just giving us a nice gap in between these things, which helps separate that content a bit. Now the height of this card is really being determined by the content inside of it. If this image went in here, this gap would disappear because there's no extra space to fill up. But because our image is taking up more space than is needed just to fit this content, it's making everything a little bit taller, which gives us a gap here. Just to kind of demonstrate that, I'll make sure I have my image selected here and I'll go to the sizing and we'll make our size of our image something like 900 pixels tall. And you'll see when we do that, obviously our image looks terrible, but it's just to demonstrate that gap that's being created by that Flexbox change we had there. By setting the space between, it's putting this top container all the way at the top and pushing this bottom container with our 4 items all the way down to the bottom. Now, obviously I don't want my image to be that big, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that out of here so we can get back to where we were before. Now you might have noticed actually when I put that at 900 pixels that our image is getting cropped kind of funny. If we go down here into our media settings, you can see by default this is set our image object fit to cover. By default in CSS, this would just be set to default, which is going to squish everything. GenerateBlocks has made the decision anytime you change the size of the image to go ahead and change this object fit to cover, and in most cases, that's probably what you're going to want. The only thing in this specific example that I'd want to change is the position of how this is being cropped. I always want to see that top left corner here, so I'm going to change that object position to top left, and that's just going to make sure that when it crops the image, it's always focusing on this top left corner, so we don't get this part of the image cropped out. Now, obviously 900 pixels is too big, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that, but now we'll make sure that we have everything cropping the way we want to if this section did get bigger. I didn't do a great job of cropping out this image. You can kind of see a little bit of black at that top corner. I'm just going to go in here, one off on this image and add a little bit of border radius just to get rid of that. We'll make sure this top left radius has a bit of a bigger border just to make sure I can kind of cut off that mistake I made inside Photoshop. Now this time I did do this on the default GenerateBlocks class because I don't want to do that to every image that gets put inside of these service cards. I probably want to crop my images better before I upload them, but for now that will give us a quick fix so that doesn't make my eye twitch. Now the last thing we need to do to this layout before we start addressing the responsiveness is this kind of glow that's happening behind the image here. There are a few different ways we could tackle this, but this isn't quite like a box shadow on the image. You can see it's much more defined here in the corners than it is up here at the top. I think the first thing we'll do to explore recreating something like this is just setting a gradient on our background of the card. We'll see how that looks, and if that doesn't work, I have a couple other ideas in mind. We'll go back in here and pop open our list view. We'll make sure that we have our card selected and make sure we're on that service card class. Here under backgrounds, you can see we've already set that background color to our sand color, but I want to add another background here and I want to change it to a gradient. Now, by default, we have two color stops inside of our gradient. We have this dark black and a dark gray. I'm going to change those, of course, but if you needed to add more colors, you can click this add color button here to add more colors. So we'll go ahead and just start by grabbing this lime green color and then our sand color, which was the original background of this card. Now, of course, the direction of this gradient isn't quite right, and we can adjust that over here by adjusting the angle. And I'm just going to kind of put it at a bit of an angle over here just to make sure that it's kind of shining from this bottom right corner. Now, the green is extending way too far here, so what I'm going to do is just drag this handle for our sand color and make sure to bring it back in. I think something like 50%, maybe just slightly over 50%, so it goes a little bit further than our image. We'll go ahead and click off of that and see what that looks like. Honestly, I think that's close enough for this card. I had another idea in mind where we could set up a pseudo element and put it in the background, but honestly, I think that's more work than it's worth in this case. This is close enough to that original design that I'm pretty happy with it. At this point, I think the desktop version is looking pretty good. Now we need to turn our attention to making this responsive. By default, since we didn't really set up any responsive settings, you can see as I go into tablet mode here, things look terrible, and they only get worse as I go into my mobile version. Now, I don't have anything already mocked up for what this looks like in responsive settings. I often don't design out those responsive views and kind of do those on the fly here inside WordPress, which may or may not be best practice, but it works for me. So instead, we're going to have to kind of plan out what we want to happen in this card. I don't think it's going to make much sense for the image to come before the text, so I think the text is going to have to be the first thing as these stack into a single column. So what we'll do is just make sure that once we go to tablet, this left column takes up 100% of its width, and this right column stacks down underneath it, taking up 100% as well. So let's go ahead and make that change first. We'll go here to our card where we've set that grid. We'll make sure we're on the service card class, and we'll go down to our tablet view. Now you'll just have to remember how all this was set on desktop, because for whatever reason, when you go down to the tablet version, we're still seeing that the CSS grid is trickling down to this tablet version, but we don't see that in the UI over here. So a lot of times I'll just go ahead and make sure we set that to display grid here on tablet as well. But this time in our grid template columns, instead of having the default for the 2 columns, I'm going to change this to just a single column, which will stack this content on the top and the image down on the bottom, because that's the order they come in inside of our DOM. The left column comes first, so it's going to go to the top. Now, as far as the layout for this, I think this top column looks perfect in this layout, but I do want to make a few tweaks to this image down here. Obviously, it's way too tall for this instance, and I want to make sure I get this left padding over here to kind of match what we have on the left side of this card here. So we'll go into our right column here, make sure we're on that service card image wrapper, and here under the padding, I'm going to make sure to match that same 60 pixels of padding on the left-hand side, which will just align everything nicely. Now we have to decide how we want to scale this image down so it's not so tall in here. To do that, I think I'll go ahead and select the image. We didn't give this a class before, so we'll go ahead and give this a class now. Service card _ featured -image, just to make sure if we add any other images in here later, this is kind of the big featured image. We'll go ahead and move all those local block styles to our class here. And now that we're still on this tablet breakpoint, I'm going to go into our sizing and maybe change this aspect ratio to something like 16:9. Even though we put that 16:9 aspect ratio, nothing happened here. And that's because some of these settings are trickling down from our desktop. We have the width set to auto. These were the things that were on the block that I just moved over to our class. Well, here on our tablet version, I want to go ahead and keep that width at 100%, so it takes up all the space that's available. But I want to set the height to auto, which is just going to let it respect this aspect ratio we set up. So now if we click off of that, we can see here that the image is kind of pushed to the bottom right, which is definitely the look I'm going for with this, but it's getting that padding on the left-hand side, which kind of makes things line up nicely. There is a pretty big gap in between these two sets of content, and that's coming from the top padding we had set on this right column. So I think here on tablet view, if we go back into that image wrapper class, we can go ahead and zero out that padding at the top of the column here, just to scrunch these things back together. I think it makes more sense for them to be closer. And as far as a tablet layout, I think this looks pretty good. The only thing I'm not loving is the direction of our gradient now, which is getting too much in our text and I think should be focused more around our image. So again, back into our card, we'll go into the service card. and we'll go down to our backgrounds. Now, just like not being able to see that it's set to display grid, even though those things are trickling down, we can't actually control any of those backgrounds we set up on our desktop. Once we get down here to tablet, we have to go and add that background again. So I'm going to go ahead and go to our gradient. We'll set our colors again. In this case, this is all pretty simple, so it's not a big deal. We'll go ahead and set those, and then we can work on getting this angle of it just the way we want. I think we want to make sure that the angle is a little bit steeper here, so the green stays focused down at the bottom of the card. Again, I want to bring that sand color down quite a bit. I'm just taking a look at how it's showing up here over our text. I think peeking in just to a little bit of the text is fine. We'll click off of this just to see how it looks without any of the UI selected, and I think that works pretty well, and this should trickle down nicely to our mobile version as well. At this point, I think we're good on tablet, so we'll go down to mobile, and we have a few problems here. Obviously, we don't want this to be a 2-column grid anymore, and the padding around this card is just too big at this point. So we have the padding set on this left column here, and we have some set on this right column here where the image is being pushed off from the edge. So I'm going to go to our service card content wrapper class. We'll make sure that we're in the spacing here. We can see right now it's inheriting that 60 pixels. We want to tighten this up quite a bit. I'll start with something like 24 pixels, which I think is more appropriate for the scale of this. I want to make sure that that matches down here on our right column where we push this image from the side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now before I forget. And we'll just make sure that this left padding is set to 24 pixels as well. That way we have this nice clean line all the way down the side of our card again. Now, as far as this grid, I think all of these can just stack. So we'll go in here into our left column. We have our features wrapper, which is where we set this grid for 2 columns. So I'll make sure we're on that class. Again, we'll set this to display grid, and we'll change the grid template columns to 1FR, which will just stack all these on top of each other. Now they are spaced out a little bit, and that's coming from the row gap we had already set of 24 pixels. In this case, I think that works fine here on mobile as well. So I think everything looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and save our changes here so we can go preview everything on the front end. We'll go ahead and view this page. And here we can see everything on the front end of the website. We'll go ahead and use our inspector here just so we can play around with all the responsive settings and see how things worked out. We can see once we get to our tablet breakpoint here, these 2 columns stack, which is great. And as we get down to our mobile breakpoint, everything stacks inside this column. Now, if I was being really picky about this, I really don't love this breakpoint for mobile. By default, it's set to 768 pixels inside GeneratePress. So once we go down to 767, it's going to go ahead and break this to our mobile breakpoint. For me, that's just a little bit too soon. I think this section could actually stay 2-column here until we get quite a bit smaller. Of course, there's not a lot of devices in this kind of 500 to 700 range, maybe some tablets. And most of the time what people are going to be seeing is probably something closer to this, which is what they're going to see on their mobile phone, which is probably fine, but it never hurts to be a little bit too picky. So let's go ahead and set up a custom media query for this. We'll go back into our edit here, pop open our list view so we can get back to the right section, which is our left column, and then the features wrapper. We'll go back into that features wrapper class. We'll go back here to our mobile version, which we set to be 1FR, and I'm just going to get rid of that so it goes back to the 2 columns we had before. Instead of this breaking at the 767 breakpoint, I'm going to create my own custom breakpoint for this. So we'll click the rule options here and click add new. In here, we're going to type @media. We'll open and close our parentheses here. And inside of this, I'm going to put max-width, put my colon, and then we can decide how wide we want this to be. I probably never want these columns to be skinnier than maybe 300 pixels wide. So let's go ahead and set our media query at 600 pixels. That's something we should have probably checked on the front end first just to really dial in where we wanted that breakpoint to happen. But as an educated guess, I think 600 pixels is going to work okay. We'll go ahead and hit create. And then here, we'll just go ahead and put back our 1FR. We'll go ahead and save those changes. We'll go view it on the front end again, go back into the inspector. I'm going to zoom this back into 100%. And now let's keep an eye on when this breaks into a single column. Before, since this was set to our default, which was 767, these would have already broke into that single column, which I didn't love. But now that shouldn't happen until we get right at 600 pixels. And you can see it went from here to here. And I think our guess on the 600 pixels was pretty close. I don't think I'd want these scrunched up very much more than they are right now. So I think that's a pretty good place for these to break. Of course, as we get smaller and smaller, everything works perfectly. So those custom media queries can really come in handy. Now, obviously, we didn't build anything too complicated in today's video, but that was kind of the point. I really just wanted to walk you through my process of how I would set up a typical section like this in the hopes that maybe you'd pick up some pointers as far as workflow and process. Now that everything's changed in GenerateBlocks 2.0, we have to build up some new muscle memory so we can really take advantage of all the new features we have in place. I'd love to know what you thought of today's video, so if you would, leave me a comment down below and let me know if you thought this was useful. I'm constantly finding different little layouts like this and rebuilding them just to practice my own skills, and if you enjoy this kind of video, I'd be happy to record those sessions and put out more content like this. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.